Hello, everyone. It's Ryan with Curbside to Bedside, and Floyd and I are here today to discuss the use of lights and sirens in EMS. Probably one of the most controversial and highly contested topics that does not deserve the amount of attention that it receives.
Yeah, I was surprised that it's controversial. Just instinctively, I thought that reducing the amount of lights and sirens just made sense, right? Because we all thought, or we all knew that ambulance crashes are more likely to happen when you're using lights and sirens.
I think there's a perception that anytime you flip the emergency light master switch on, along with the wheeling box, that you're conferred with some sort of fairy godmother power that makes you absolutely invincible to everything and instills you with an outrageous sense of self-righteousness.
Yes, and that is absolutely not true. I find it really interesting that people think that if they run up on somebody or just another person on the road, if they're using lights and sirens, that person should see them or hear them when they're 200, 300, 400 feet behind them and just get out of the way. But that's not how it works, is it?
Not at all. And it's kind of ridiculous to even assume that in the modern age, because how many cars have excellent soundproofing? Like, philosophical grounds aside, if I just ran up behind you at a full sprint and they're like, bro, why aren't you getting out of my way? You'd kind of be a little bit annoyed and probably a lot startled. But in the modern age, with the soundproofing in cars, I listen to music just about 24/7 or a podcast anytime I'm driving. And then take into account you're distracted driving with the use of a phone or whatever else people do while they drive, which is a multitude of things. People just start paying attention. There should be no expectation of situational awareness from the general populace, right?
Exactly.
So our anger collectively as a profession is a little bit unjustified because we don't recognize the variables in the environment that we work in. We just assume that everyone's a very astute driver that is always on the lookout for that one ambulance they may see that month.
With
that
no
is happening
music.
to come up behind them.
No music, windows rolled down in the middle of winter.
Yeah, like it was only negative 33 degree wind chill in Columbus where I was recently. Surely to God, everyone's got their windows down just so they can hear that one ambulance, fire truck, or police car coming up behind them.
I mean, I like blaring my music every now and then, and you can't tell me, to all you people listening out there, that you don't like that either. And don't judge me.
I like metal. I like heavy metal and like screamy metal. I like noisy stuff. So if I'm jamming out, I'm probably not going to hear that ambulance coming up behind me.
And I've had them roll up behind me, lights and sirens blaring. I'm like, dude, I'm sorry. I just saw you. Give me a second to get out of the way.
I still want one of those little electronic, like LED rolly text things in my back windshield just so I can have a set of preset buttons that just says stuff like, I'm sorry, or give me a second.
Yeah. Dude, is it really that big of an emergency?
Probably not. And we'll get into that.
So what really sparked this discussion, and I haven't seen anybody else in the podcast world talk about this, even though I'm sure somebody's going to post it before we get ours out, and that's okay. But what really brought this up is there was a recent article published last week or the week before last titled, "Is the use of warning lights and sirens associated with increased risk of ambulance crashes?"
Spoiler alert, yes.
It is. Surprisingly, they said that they were the first to definitively link lights and sirens use with ambulance crashes. Now, there was an NHTSA paper, it's like a white paper that was put out. When was it published?
It was published in 2017, I believe.
2017. So if you were to read this paper, and I recommend that everybody else involved in EMS, pre-hospital medicine, ambulance transportation, go and read this. But if you were to go and read that, you'd say, these guys, they called it all along. They got it right, because there were a lot of studies that linked the use of lights and sirens to increased crashes, but apparently they weren't statistically significant or something. I don't know. Whoops. So
I think it should be somewhat intuitive that the use of whoop-whoops is going to confer a greater risk of bodily harm to you secondary to a collision of some sorts. Like that, it shouldn't be that much of a mental leap. to assume that.
So I think the question we have to ask is why? Why is it that when we use lights and sirens, there's an increased risk of crashing? First, let's throw the statistics out there. Okay. In this article, not the NHTSA paper, the other one, the response crash rate. So when responding to a call, it was 4.6 out of 100,000 without the use of lights and sirens. That's not too bad. With the use of lights and sirens, it was 5.4 out of 100,000. Still okay, a little bit more, which you would expect. However, when they were transporting patients from the scene, without the use of lights and sirens, it was 7 out of 100,000, which is surprising, right? Because they were not using lights and sirens. You would think that it would be about the same. However, when transporting patients with the use of lights and sirens, it increased to a staggering 17.1 out of 100,000. Now we asked why that is. The authors from the paper stated that they think that during response, two providers are in the front and share the cognitive load required to operate an ambulance. And being in an ambulance, whether or not you're a provider or a patient, it does a lot to you physiologically, right? It causes this sympathetic surge. And I got to find the statistics, even for a patient in the back. Previous studies found that there was an average of a 30% increase in the heart rate and an average of 14 millimeters of mercury increase in their blood pressure. So it has some pretty deleterious physiological side effects.
I'm trying this on my next hypotensive patient. N of 1. Let's see if the sirens work.
Yeah.
I'm not actually going to do that to anyone out there listening who's criticizing me at the moment.
Hey, pain is an effective vasopressor, right?
Yeah. If you're barbaric.
So then NHTSA, I think in their first paragraph, actually the first word or sentence, they said primum non nocere. Did I say that right?
Your Latin's a little bit rusty, but I grew up Catholic, so I've got a little bit of a jump on you.
Which means
everyone should be familiar with this concept. Hopefully you were introduced to it on your first day of EMT school, which is the overriding concept of medicine, which is to first do no harm. So are we doing harm by transporting patients with lights and sirens?
Yeah, and the use of lights and sirens, we need to think of as an intervention, a operational or maybe even a medical intervention.
I would say it's a medical intervention. I'd say that this is clinical therapy.
Yeah, with every intervention, we need to weigh the risk versus benefit of every single aspect of care, and which includes thinking of lights and sirens as an intervention. And with any intervention, there are specific indications, and there are also risks associated. The risk being that you could crash, and we're not doing anyone any good, and we're actually causing harm if that happens.
And I'm totally on board with the culture of the overriding principle, let me put it this way, of safety third. But I am not on board with rendering ineffective, possibly useless, and arguably harmful treatments to patients that also happens to put my life on the line needlessly. And I think most people would agree with that.
Yeah, I think that safety third, it doesn't mean that you should put yourself in an unnecessary position that creates risk for you, your partner, or your patient.
Absolutely. And I think it also confers that there is such a thing as acceptable risk. And discussing risk management principles is well beyond A, my intelligence, and B, the scope of this particular podcast. But risk assessment and risk management is its own discipline for a good reason. And we have to look at this thing as a risk both operationally, to me, to my partner, to my patient, but also clinically. Like, what kind of benefit are we actually going to confer on the patient by stacking the odds against them in terms of this risk of crashing and incurring great bodily harm or even death. And one of the principles from the NHTSA paper, and as an aside, we're going to say the NHTSA paper over and over, and basically that's the U.S. Department of Transportation and National Highway Traffic Safety Administration Office of Emergency Medical Services, because EMS still hasn't gotten its head out of its ass to be an actual legitimately clinically recognized organization under Department of Health and Human Services, but that's just my opinion. It's important to realize that this document was not written by some guy with a degree in traffic engineering, but an actual physician by the name of Douglas F. Kupas, if I'm saying that right, who is not only a physician, but he is a paramedic. He is fellowship.
EMS fellow?
Yeah, I guess that's the right term. He's an EMS fellow and a board-certified emergency physician. So the document that we are referencing was written by a gentleman who has arguably a lot more credentials than most EMS medical directors across the country.
Yeah, it's a very extensive document. And any person in a position of management or any supervisor should actually read this document, because they outline the risk versus benefit of ambulance transport, safety standards, and they provide some benchmarks. Their benchmarks, I think, are interesting. They say that we need to benchmark reducing lights and sirens to less than 50% during response. Now, most places I've worked, nobody has the appropriate infrastructure in place to properly do that. You need a well coordinated and well trained emergency medical dispatchers. But the other benchmark is something that we are directly in control of, and that benchmark is to reduce the use of lights and sirens to less than 5% during transport.
Which I would agree, that's a pretty good benchmark, because if you look at the literature that surrounds this topic, that's generous given the amount of patients that actually will benefit from the use of lights and sirens in the reduced time to, which is not even that significant, to be honest.
Yeah, and that's one
to definitive medical care.
And that's one of the common arguments for the use of lights and sirens. And it's funny because the history, do you want to talk about the history? You want me to?
Yeah, I'll talk about the history. So anyway, yeah, I would be happy to talk kind of about the history. So the general attitude of our use of lights and sirens sort of stems from the genesis of EMS. So like 1950s, pre-white paper time, to sort of through probably just kind of spitballing here, the mid 70s, where the overwhelming majority of EMS practitioners in this sort of nascent system were first aid attendants only, and they were not trusted to discern if a patient was stable or not. So the strategy by receiving clinicians at the hospital to delegate out to the attendants on the front line was to basically just rapidly transport all of the patients that you encountered, with the underlying presumption being that any patient that you touched could or would deteriorate unless proven otherwise after their arrival at a hospital. So basically, you were completely denigrated as a clinician because of a lack of education. You couldn't discern whether or not a patient was stable, so it was sort of a catch-all approach. And it was what I personally call the body snatching method. You just kind of show up, put them in the truck, haul ass to the hospital.
Yeah.
However, that approach doesn't really reconcile with the current advances in out-of-hospital care, where the vast majority of illnesses and injuries that we encounter can be effectively treated, or at least the life-threatening effects of them can be mitigated or treated in our care, because we are more educated and more capable providers than those of yore.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of push for increased vehicle safety standards. But I am surprised that there's not an outcry trying to push for a decreased use of lights and sirens. I think that should be championed right along with the need for increased vehicle safety.
And I absolutely agree, because while I am 100% on board with improving the safety features in the vehicles that I ride in, those are thousands of dollars of upgrades, right? Thousands of dollars, excuse me, from a purely practical point to spend on the safety of your providers and your patients, which honestly, money should not be an option in that regard if you truly care about your employees or the people that you care for in your community. But nonetheless, how easy is it to turn a switch, Floyd?
Yeah. Let's see where you're going. It's easy.
That's a life-saving measure sometimes. Like, how much risk can you reduce by simply not flipping a switch? What if I told you that there's a switch on the wall right now, and that if you flipped it 17.1 times out of 100,000, you would incur great bodily harm or death as a result of flipping that switch? Would you flip the switch? Probably not.
I don't know. I might just want to see what happens.
I mean, there is kind of like the call of the void and the kind of morbid curiosity. I get with that, but most reasonable people probably wouldn't flip that switch.
Yeah. So,
and that's kind of what this decision boils down to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think to get people to not flip that switch, we have to dispel some dogma and some common arguments for the use of lights and sirens. The most three common that I hear are A, it saves time, B, and time is brain and muscle, and C, it's public expectation that we're going to rush to their home and we're going to rush them to the hospital. So let's talk about saving time. Does it save time?
No.
And I think we can say that pretty unequivocally, right? That the use of lights and sirens only saves a marginal amount of times. And in the NHTSA paper, at most it saved, when they looked at a bunch of different data from various EMS services, at most it saved 3 to 4 minutes. But most EMS services, it saved much less than that. So let's say that it saves 10 minutes. I really can't think of a patient that I had where 10 minutes would have made the difference between life or death. Can you?
Not absolutely. And I can't really say. I can think of some patients that probably would have been very well served, but I can't think of a patient in my experience or the kind of collective experience in just talking with other providers on the tailboard where 10 minutes would have definitively, that time, that temporal aspect of their care would have 100% unequivocally made the difference between living and dying.
And I found this interesting. Greenville, North Carolina, looked at their data and found that using lights and sirens saved an average of 43.5 seconds. So there may be some people that say we have a high unit hour utilization, and if we don't transport using lights and sirens, it's gonna that time's going to accumulate. We could run out of ambulances. And this is a quote from the NHTSA that I just want to share. They said that communities should not use lack of EMS resources to justify unnecessary use of lights and sirens with its inherent risk. So these are some numbers from the NHTSA paper. They say that rear occupants are 2.7 times more likely to die in a crash. Interestingly, what I find most interesting is that the rate of EMS deaths related to transportation, which is 9.6 out of 100,000, exceeds the rate for law enforcement and firefighter deaths related to transportation. Rear occupants in the ambulance are 2.7 times more likely to be killed in an ambulance crash. So let's talk a little bit more about time, because I find this whole time thing very interesting. And I think
it's a flawed premise.
I hope you don't mind if I go on a little bit of a rant.
Rant away.
We build everything. We sign contracts based on time. And if we don't meet these time metrics, then they can void the contract, charge fines, find somebody else to cover the area. We talk a lot about fractile response time. We say that needs to be 8 minutes. Just for the sake of simplicity, let's say we need our response time to be an average of 8 minutes, a certain percentage of the time. where do we get this 8 minutes from? This 8 minutes stems from a study in Seattle based on cardiac arrest. And they found that when their response times were shorter, there was more of a survival from cardiac arrest. But this study...
And what year was this?
1979.
Okay, just making sure.
Yeah. So since then, we've realized that it's not... What matters is not how fast an ambulance gets there. It's how fast the first arriving aid gets there that can provide defibrillation and CPR. And now that we have almost widespread telecommunicator CPR, rapid dispatch systems, and law enforcement officers who are already out in our community that can respond with an AED, that doesn't matter as much. EMSA, IMSA, which is a service where they locate.
I think they're in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Oklahoma, yes, Tulsa, Oklahoma. So they have changed their time standards.
Or maybe not. Maybe it's Oklahoma City. I can't. I know they're in Oklahoma.
It's in Oklahoma. It's a very large service.
Yeah, somewhere in the Midwest.
Yeah, they participate in a lot of studies, but they have changed their time standards. They have changed that 8 minutes for priority 1 calls, which would be strokes, cardiac arrest, chest pain. They changed it from 8 minutes to 10 minutes and 59 seconds. For basically everyone else, priority 2 calls, they've changed it to 24 minutes and 59 seconds. They only respond to about 33% of calls using lights and sirens. Surprisingly, they have not observed any changes in cardiac arrest survival rates when making these changes.
What about that? It's almost like bystander CPR is probably one of the most critical chains in the cardiac arrest chain of survival. But that point notwithstanding, I think it's a very interesting case study in conflating our egos. I think the general attitude of EMS as a whole is that we are here to save the day and no one else can do it as well as we can, which may be partially true in few aspects.
And in a few aspects, it's not.
In many more aspects, we are not nearly as effective or as important as we make ourselves out to be. And I think that that is a harsh reality, but I think it is a humbling reality. And we need to enable and recognize this because we are over and over and over shooting ourselves in the foot with arbitrarily derived response times and concepts that have no basis in evidence or no basis in patient-centered outcomes or even provider safety, which is a common sort of trope that many things have been foisted upon us under the guise of, that's about provider safety. How many initiatives have you seen done in the guise of provider safety that cost an untold amount of money, that had limited efficiency? But the one most salient threat, the biggest skeleton in our closet, the amount of people who have died in ambulance crashes, and the only thing it took was a slight culture change and not flipping a fucking switch. So I think the points that you brought up kind of, at least with the classic 8-minute response time that a lot of contracts and stuff are formed under, is a classic example of something called Goodhart's Law. And Charles Goodhart was who this law was named after. It was a economist based in the United Kingdom. And essentially this law says that any observed statistical regularity will tend to collapse once pressure is placed upon it for control purposes. Now, Marilyn Strathern kind of simplified this and said when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And in my opinion, an 8-minute response time or an otherwise arbitrarily derived, outdated response time is not a good measure of how we provide care to our patients within our communities and affect good clinical outcomes.
Going back to response time, I think if you really want to reduce your response time, you don't look at your response time. You look at your out of chute time. How long does it take the person to get in the ambulance and get the wheels rolling once they receive the call? And I think that's how the best way to shorten your overall response time. And it may mean changing your the model a little bit. But when we talk about response times, And then we talk about time is brain or time is muscle. And that's probably the most common argument that I hear, is that there's a possibility that this person having chest pain could be having ischemic type pain that needs rapid reperfusion. And that if we get them to the hospital faster, then they're going to perform the coronary intervention faster, and that's going to lead to an improvement in outcomes. Surprisingly, and this is coming directly from the NHTSA article, rendering a coronary intervention sooner by 10 minutes would decrease death by 0.4%. That's a very marginal decrease. And when we talk about cardiac arrest, the best chance of survival from out of hospital cardiac arrest is to obtain return of circulation on scene. So if you want to improve survival from cardiac arrest, you're going to work them on scene. And transporting them using lights and sirens has absolutely nothing to do with it. Most of the interventions that the ER is going to perform, at least in my area, most of the interventions they are going to perform is nothing that's any different than what I'm going to perform on scene.
Yeah, the lion's share of cardiac arrest is just bread and butter ACLS. The exceptions to that rule are generally your case study worthy cases of refractory VF or something like that. They go on ECMO. Mm-hmm. Like very, very, very far and few between. And even pediatric arrests are the same way. You have greater survival benefit conferred upon that cohort by working them diligently on scene than you do throwing them in the back and going back to the body snatching of yore. And I think this speaks to a larger point, which is, does the use of lights and sirens actually save lives in the manner that the perception of most EMS providers out there, at least in my experience, think it does? And I would like to take a little bit of a detour and discuss some of the evidence that's relevant to this issue. So in no particular order, Anderson in 2014, this is a study in Denmark that looked for morbidity by studying about 94,488 patients transported without lights and sirens. And they found that only 152 patients, or 0.16% of the cohort study, died the same day as their ambulance transport. And further, a panel of pre-hospital anesthesiologists, who's kind of the governing discipline in Denmark, as I understand it, reviewed the patient care reports and found that only 13, or 0.02% of the cohort, actually had potentially preventable deaths. So the authors found that if every one of these deaths could have been prevented with lights and sirens transport, definitively prevented, then the number needed to treat them would have been 5,000 extra lights and sirens transports, which is staggering to think about. So essentially what they're saying is that there is no really significant detriment to transporting patients without lights and sirens. So Kupas in 1994 used a protocol-based approach to mitigate the use of lights and sirens. And then these cases underwent a physician review. In 92% of the cases where lights and sirens were not used, the receiving physicians did not identify any cases of possible morbidity due to a slower transport. So what we're seeing there is a notion that slower transport doesn't have as much of an effect on patient morbidity that maybe we thought previously. Merlin in 2012 developed an even simpler protocol for lights and sirens transport, which reduced lights and sirens transport in a urban environment from 49.6% to 29% for patients transported by ALS providers. So a huge decrease in the amount of lights and sirens transported patients, and a huge increase in the safety margin for both patients and providers. And I'm going to butcher this name here. Marquis Baista in 2010 given a relatively small cohort of patients, 112 patients, transported with lights and sirens and found that only 5 of those patients received a time-critical intervention when they got to the emergency department, and that none of those procedures were done within the 2.62 minutes that was saved by lights and sirens transport. Essentially saying that very few of the patients that we transport with the whoop whoops on will actually get an intervention that is truly time-critically life-saving when they get to the emergency department, and that almost none of these procedures that are so critical will be done within the interval of time that we save by transporting them by lights and sirens. And then finally, Newgard in 2010, based off of the Resuscitations Outcome Consortium, studied some outcomes for injured patients treated by 146 EMS agencies who transported to 51 Level 1 and Level 2 trauma centers in 10 North American communities. This was a large study, and it found no association between survival and EMS time intervals, including response time and transport time, which is contrary to everything that we know, or we think we know, about the golden hour and trauma care. I think that's a very interesting study. But this is an abbreviation. We don't have time to get into the body of it.
Yeah, I think something more interesting is that Maryland decreased their use of helicopter EMS and increased mortality. I don't know if you saw that that paper or article that came out, but that was pretty surprising. They
decreased their use of HIMS?
Significantly decreased their use of helicopter EMS and
increased their
survival.
Mortality or increased survival rates?
Improved survival.
Okay, so the
decreased mortality.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so a lot of stuff is kind of coming out and destroying these myths and dogma that we thought was true. So the last piece of dogma or argument against the use of lights and sirens that I hear commonly is that it is public expectation. The public expects that when they call 911, an ambulance is going to swoop in using lights and sirens, scoop them up, and transport them rapidly to the hospital. And I think that we have done a pretty good job of changing the public's perception of what we do. I think that this clinician mindset that we've been espousing for the past few years or so is starting to catch on. But either way, if we're concerned about public perception, how would the public feel knowing that we circumvent traffic using lights and sirens for no reason other than to bypass the traffic, get to the hospital sooner, or because our EMS services don't have the resources that they need? I still don't think that's an acceptable reason to use lights and sirens.
Well, none of those are, especially the latter of those two, because what does that say about your employer, right? So if everyone truly understands the risk associated with the use of lights and sirens, and you're having to use lights and sirens to mitigate traffic and get back to the county sooner to respond to calls for service, essentially what's that saying is your life, in my mind at least, in my opinion, is that your life is expendable. We are okay with the absolutely astronomical increased risk of death or bodily harm to get you back in county to take a call. And that speaks to some very poor and, in my opinion, morally bankrupt practices. If it is that bad, put more damn ambulances on the road.
Fix the system.
It's a system problem.
It's
not a provider issue. It has never been a provider issue in that situation. That is a system issue 110% of the time. I think that's a difficult realization to come to, because which one of those two is easier? Flip a switch, or try and argue with the fiscal court for 6 months about how we need to put 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 more ambulances on the road and then staff them appropriately. That notwithstanding, we know what the right answer is in that situation.
So, other than the risk of crashing an ambulance, there's another risk.
Do we want to talk more about the public perception And that quote.
Do you want to talk more about the public perception?
Well, I always do.
Well, let's hear it.
I think we tend to infuse our own opinions into what public perception is versus what we see it is, or what we see it as. And there was a really good quote by E. Marie Wilson in 1992, and she said that competence is more often shown by quiet deliberateness than by noisy bravado. And that quote came from a study that was actually dealing with a survey about EMS use of lights and sirens. And my personal belief is that a lot of our defense and a lot of our traditional use of lights and sirens is noisy bravado. And that most people don't actually enjoy the use of lights and sirens. I don't think the public is particularly reassured by some flashy lights and loud noises, and arguably they're probably more scared by it. It's not the Wailing sponsored Christmas tree that rolls up to their front door that truly makes a difference. It's the person that comes out of that fancy decorated box and treats them that makes the difference. So this is derived from survey-based literature, which has a ton of flaws associated with it, but you can't do a real randomized controlled trial with public opinion, essentially. So there was a phone survey conducted in Connecticut, and basically it cited that siren noise was the primary reason for being uncomfortable for calling EMS during an emergency. These are people that are having an emergency and are having hesitations calling EMS. And then the other thing was the public was uncomfortable with getting, quote, lots of attention. But an interesting part that I found was that the families of terminally ill patients who died at home sometimes felt anger with EMS, and that lights and sirens response was singled out as one of the reasons for this. Another survey from the United Kingdom that was a little bit more recent found that 1/3 of drivers, so going back to the practical portion of actually being on the road, reported feeling stressed when navigating away from approaching emergency vehicles that had lights and sirens activated, and that the authors believe that the drivers found the interactions with emergency vehicles inconvenient, which is probably right, and potentially dangerous, which is absolutely right. Point being that the public perception trope is nothing more than that. It's a trope. I don't think most people really care whether or not we come to their aid with lights and sirens ablaze. I think they care a lot more about the people and the quality of the people and the care that they render that get out and actually meet them. And I think that's what we should be focusing on.
I agree. And if you're concerned about how your community feels about you, or if you don't know how they feel about you, then that's probably an issue in and of itself. But other than the risk associated with transporting lights and sirens, or the obvious risk of crashing an ambulance, there's a risk of not only crashing an ambulance, but getting sued for lots of money. Recently, there was a case where Seattle had to pay $65.75 million to the victim of an ambulance crash. And that kind of woke everyone up, I think, to the possibilities and the liabilities of transporting patients unnecessarily using lights and sirens. And hey, if this is what it takes to change systems and change how we transport patients, then so be it. Surprisingly, in 1996, way back in 1996, Wolfberg of, I'm sure you know, the infamous Page, Wolfberg, and Worth, they found that ambulance crashes are the most common cause of insurance claims greater than $10,000 in EMS agencies. So there you have it. You have multiple reasons to decrease the use of lights and sirens, both to and from a scene.
I agree. And I think, and once again, this is just unadulterated opinion, a hot take, if you will, that if you truly give a shit about the people that you employ, about the person to your left and to your right, with your partner, and with the patients in your community that you care for, that you will take a good hard look at both the evidence that we're presenting and then your own personal practice and decide what is most important to you. And hopefully, the result of that conversation with yourself and hopefully with your colleagues will result in more lives saved by decreasing the risk that's associated with licensed sirens use.
All right, folks. If you guys have any questions, let us know. You know how to get a hold of us. Social media is @curbtobed. Email curbtobed@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.